No nonsense and no gibberish. You're Godzilla of the truth. You're commander of common sense. We're the adults in the room. Get your big boy pants on. Daryl Gene Bank coming up. That's right. Daryl Bank. He's been in the papers a lot, and we've got him on the line. And Daryl is a managing partner of his investment firm. Been there for some time. Been a frequent guest on our show, radio talk show host like me, and have a long history with his Mrs. Katrina Bank, who I used to work with when I was with the Virginian Pilot. I was a consultant there for some time, and she was in marketing, and so we worked together there and got a lot done on behalf of the Pilot way back in the day. Now they're in Florida. Joining us now, Daryl Bank. Daryl, man, it's been too long.
Good morning, John. It has.
Yeah, man, it's been way too long. So, look, I just got to start with this, Daryl. I was excited to get you on today because you had to fight charges in Florida. And a couple weeks ago, a Florida jury dismissed all criminal charges against you. And this has been carried in the Virginia Pilot in Virginia. And it was kind of a sham, the whole thing. It was a scam. And you stood up to them kind of like Bob McDonald did. And you battled back. And all the charges got dismissed. And so the whole thing was a sham. Can you kind of share with our audience what happened there, Daryl?
John, it's a much bigger story, but let me share it with you as short as I can. Literally, I came home from a business trip. What I now know was a process server, a person who did not identify themselves, did not make themselves known, obstructed my son from shutting the front door, put her hands on him, and when I came around the corner, she was coming through the front door of my house. Now, John, the amazing thing was I was 40 feet from the front door of my house, 40 feet. Coming back from a business trip, I'm licensed to carry a firearm, been licensed in the state of Virginia, now Florida, since I was old enough to carry a sidearm. 40 feet into my house, John, I see this person coming into my house, don't know what their intent is, have no idea what they're doing. Obviously, pull my firearm, instruct them to get out of my house, and the long story short is told my story to the police, and the next thing you know, for the last year and a half, I'm battling for my liberty on a case where a person who was not known to me, did not identify themselves, assaulted my son, committing burglary, came into my house, and like any American, defending my home, not even just my life, but my home as well. And the next thing you know, I'm in a year-and-a-half battle for my liberty.
It's unbelievable, Daryl. And the process server that came in to basically serve you with papers, right? This happens to people all the time, or businesses, you get served. It's what the sheriff's office do as part of what they do. But normally when they have that, they identify themselves. They're decked out in the garb that makes you know that it's an official business. They've got the sheriff's uniform on or something. But basically, this was just a contract process server, right? Not part of the sheriff's department with the badge and the car and the uniform on, right? Just somebody that came to your house.
That's right, John. I know what a policeman looks like. I know what a sheriff looks like. This person was in plain clothes, no identification, didn't identify herself. Might as well have been, and in my feeling at that moment, was a criminal, somebody that was either barging into my house, intending to harm me and my family, but no identification, unlike in Virginia where if the sheriff or police shows up with a subpoena, you know who they are.
Right, because they knock on the door, and even if they were not to identify themselves, they're identified by what they're wearing. In Florida, they have what they have contract process service. Basically, they pay people. It's a job, and they go out and they get people to sign the thing. They serve people, and then they get paid for doing that, plus mileage. So it's a very different situation. So think about this. You're sitting there one day in your home, and somebody comes into your house, which is a process server, doesn't identify themselves. They have a firearm. They just come into your home. You don't know who they are. What are you going to do? So you're going to be concerned about your family. If you have a weapon, you're going to take it out. That's the purpose of it, right? So you take it out.
Exactly.
And then, all this happens. But then what happens is you get in the system and you battle it for 18 months. And it costs you a lot of money. But I want you to walk everybody through, Daryl, because, this happens to people in America. Look at what happened to Bob McDonald, right, our governor. The justice system gets on you for whatever reason. They don't want to give up. They don't want to lose. And so you fight for 18 months. But walk our audience, Daryl Bank, how that trial went and the jury of your peers and how this whole thing went down.
Well, John, I want to elaborate, but also to remind you, in the studio with us is two of my counsel, Josh Deckard as well as Jason Wonder, and I'm going to yield to them in just a second. But what was amazing first is the obvious, John, is that how did we even reach this point? When the event occurred, the next day I met with the police, got my story. My wife was a witness. My son was a witness. He was assaulted. I had video still pictures of the event. This is a no-brainer. Then suddenly you realize what a bully the system can be. So just like that person that delivered the papers, nothing more than a bully, because we came to learn later, John, a business partner had come to my office 2 days before, didn't identify themselves, didn't say that what they were doing, didn't say what they want. Again, this was a tactic to bully. Jumping out of the car and finding my son taking the dog out in the front yard, an attempt to bully. Coming through the front door, an attempt to bully. Meet with the police department. I'm thinking this is a no-brainer. Next thing you know, I've got a warrant. I'm dealing with these charges. I'm thinking, oh, well, certainly once the state looks at this, this will go away. It doesn't happen. And again, it drags out for a year and a half. But, John, the best way I can describe the trial before turning it over to Josh and Jason is that 4 days, John, 4 days in a courtroom, 3 days of testimony. The jury received the case and started looking at it at about 5:30 on a Thursday evening. 8 pages of jury instructions, John. So think about it. 4 days in court, 3 days at trial, 8 pages of jury instructions. It took them less than an hour. That's how absolutely awful the system is and what they were doing to me and what they're obviously doing to other Americans. And Josh and Jason, I don't know if you want to add more into the trial itself.
Well, I would just begin.
Yeah, Josh.
By coming up with this thought, and that is, I have been in the criminal justice system for almost 40 years. The first 25 years as a law enforcement officer, and the last 15 years or so defending innocent folks just like Daryl Banks. So I've come to learn not to be surprised about anything that we see in the criminal justice system. But I believe this is a case that just speaks volumes of where there are still those amongst us, even though Florida has created legislation to protect homeowners. Florida law has created legislation to protect those who have to defend themselves, their property, or their families, such as Mr. Daryl Bank. But even though we have Florida laws on the book to protect people like Mr. Bank, there are still those in the criminal justice system, such as overzealous prosecutors, who believe in their hearts that the common folks or the citizens across the state of Florida and across America should not have the right to bear firearms and should not have the right to protect their homes, their family, or their property with firearms. And I believe that this is a case that had a combination or mixture of those feelings built in it. In the end, we had a good jury. We had a jury that was made up of representatives of Daryl Banks' community, and they got the right outcome for Mr. Bank. Mr. Warner?
And the thing is, Josh, you said it took an hour, right? I mean, you had a 4-day trial. This thing went on for 18 months. The jury decided in an hour. And look, I think you're onto something. I mean, there's a real issue in America when people do try to defend themselves and they have firearms, which is their Second Amendment right. You know, immediately you're suspect, you know, by some areas of justice and law enforcement in the United States. But the other thing I want to get to is, you know, Daryl was in a fortunate position to be able to bring on, obviously, 2 very capable lawyers, a lot of money. Here's the deal, though, Josh and Jason. There's a lot of people in the United States this same thing could happen to. They don't have the money to be able to hire top defense counsel like yourself. What happens to them? Jason.
It's an excellent point. This is Jason Wandner, and I've been doing this a long time myself, and I've represented a lot of people. And there are people out there who are accused who do not have the resources or the family support or the internal support that Mr. Bank had to fight charges like this, because let's be clear, Mr. Bank was facing at a minimum of 3 years incarceration. If he had failed in this trial and been found guilty, he would have been away from his home for at least 3 years, up to 20 years. That is something that many people cannot bear. The risk associated with going to trial and losing is almost unbearable for most people. If you do not have the resources to get the best lawyers, to have the costs, resources to take depositions, and to get experts like we had, people don't have the resources to defend themselves, even if the facts and law, like in this case, were on your side. So you make an excellent point. The system comes down on normal people who don't have resources, and it breaks them before they can defend themselves. And they end up, in order to prevent the ultimate calamity of the loss of their freedom, they end up taking pleas to jail time or to probation, puts them in the system. They end up violating for some reason because the probation officer doesn't give them a break over some technicality, and they're in the system for life. Thankfully, Mr. Bank had the resources. He came to us. We gave him the absolute best defense. He had the law and the facts on his side, despite the fact that the prosecutor and the police did a slipshod investigation, had everything in front of them that they needed to make the right decision and made the wrong decision. But as Mr. Deckard said, thankfully, the jury made the right decision.
And John, you said it right.
I tell you what.
What if the average person listening to this program? Because that's what's floored me in this whole process. The average person listening to this program right now would be either on probation, in jail right now, because I now understand. The next time you hear somebody takes a plea deal, I understand why they do it. So many times I went to Josh and Jason behind the scenes. Are you sure, guys, does anything about this case give you heartache? And time again, they said, absolutely not, Daryl. This is one of the best cases we've ever seen. But I still couldn't believe I was there, John. I still couldn't believe it went all the way to trial, and it did.
And the sad thing is, Mr. Bank, is probably only 4 or 5 folks out of 100 stand their ground and go to trial. And the reason only 4 or 5 folks out of 100 stand their ground and go to trial is because they're afraid of the outcome. What if things don't go their way at trial? They know that the outcome's certainly going to be punishment by incarceration. And then we also have a large number of folks who don't have the wherewithal to hire counsel or the experts that we brought in on your case.
I tell you, man, it's a scary situation for people. Let me just ask you this, and you don't have to, say anything that would violate Daryl's confidentiality. But in a case like this, say that was me, or I just didn't have the resources, same thing happened, and I was offered a plea, right? Even though I know I was totally innocent, because what you're saying is you can be totally innocent, didn't do anything, but doesn't matter. You don't have the resources to get top counsel like Josh and Jason is. So then you're offered a plea, and you're like, well, I'm scared, so I got to take that. Like in this case, what would a plea be that somebody might have had to take, just as an example?
Well, a lot of it depends on what defenses had been brought to bear. Even where there is attorneys or are attorneys who are fighting, they still may offer something like a felony that might contain a adjudication of guilt, which means a conviction that would go on your record for life, that would prevent you from having the right to bear arms. The right to vote would cost you potentially your job or the ability to get a job in the future, which may or may not contain a jail or prison sentence, or even, as I indicated earlier, probation. So plea offers, generally speaking, they still put the person in a situation where their future may very well be jeopardized. And in some cases, it's justifiable. There are people who obviously commit crimes that need to be punished. But in this case, clearly that was not the case. There was no plea offers that were put on the table that would have been acceptable in this case, and nothing short of dismissal was good enough in this situation. And to his credit, Mr. Banks stood up and said, "I will take nothing less than complete exoneration." And thankfully, Mr. Deckard and I were able to provide that for him at incredible risk to Mr. Bank. But there are cases every day where people are placed in the dock of justice and faced with the Hobson's choice of take a prison sentence and a plea, even though you think you're guilty, or go to trial and risk potentially the rest of your life or a substantial part of the rest of your life in prison. And they're given a few minutes with their public defenders to make that choice. And it happens every day in courtrooms around this land.
Wow.
And it's not fair, but that's the deal.
John, I can tell you in this case,
scary.
Josh Deckard speaking, the prosecutor
Josh.
did mention to Katrina Bank, Mr. Daryl Banks' wife, a proposal, and maybe she could speak to that.
Yeah, Josh, I think you're talking about when we were there for the deposition.
Your
that
deposition.
Afternoon. Yes. It was very frustrating because I felt like the prosecutor was definitely trying to intimidate Daryl through me. He threw a offer on the table. He said, I guess we don't have to go to court. Your husband can just take us 3 years. Or if he doesn't want to do that, I can always throw extra charges at him, and we can go through this all over again. And like I said, it was upsetting because I felt like he wasn't there to listen to my truth. He wasn't there to get the whole story. He was there to intimidate me and try to intimidate Daryl through me. So.
And John, let me add that the obvious of what you're thinking right now. It was bullying. That's exactly what he did. He told my wife that if I didn't accept the 3-year plea deal, he was going to throw more charges at me. And, John, guess what he did? Just as a bully tactic, he added more charges onto me.
And keep in mind, Mr. Daryl Bank has never had a criminal charge, period, in his entire lifetime.
John, I've never had a speeding ticket.
And we had a prosecutor that wouldn't put a reasonable plea offer on the table for Mr. Bank to consider. I don't believe Mr. Bank would have considered any offer, but in this case, there was absolutely no reasonable plea offer ever extended. And never was there a plea offer.
I mean, you look at what's going on out there in the world, and the fact that, I mean, it's just, I'm so glad I got you guys on, and I'm sharing this with our audience, because it is frightening to think that you're looking at 3 years in a federal prison for picking up a firearm because you didn't know who was at your door, and they didn't identify themselves, and you didn't know what was going on. It's not like you fired your weapon. You just picked it up. It's incredible. And you look at some of the other things that are going on out there, and it's like, what is going on with our justice system? And one of the reasons I had you guys on is because obviously we spent a lot of time together in Virginia Beach, Daryl, both myself and you and Katrina and your family, so I know you guys well. But also because our governor, Bob McDonnell, went through the same kind of a crazy witch hunt, and he was faced with 2 years federal prison term as well, and he didn't do anything. And, of course, he got exonerated, had to go all the way to the Supremes. But it's crazy out there what happens to people that get caught up in this that just don't have the resources to battle back. Tell us about, you were also, your company, there was a big article in the Pilot back in 2015 in Virginia Pilot, I believe, and the Securities and Exchange Commission had brought complaints against your company. You denied all that. Where is that now?
John, that case has actually been settled with the SEC. That case was settled with a no admit, no deny, so there was no finding of any fault. We were able to settle that case. And the interesting thing, John, is that it was also settled, I'm going to use a fancy word, with what's called bifurcation, meaning there was no assessment of a penalty, and we would sit down with them in the future and address any such. But the main thing is that there was no finding that we did anything wrong, and we've been able to put that behind us. And it's, again, John, it's one of these things where just like Bob McDonnell, and I know Bob, I sat with Bob at his kitchen table when he ran for the first time for office, he and his wife. I'll never forget it over in Virginia Beach. And anybody that knew Bob knows Bob doesn't have an ill will bone in his body, but you see how the system can bully people.
Right.
And you have regulators, you have prosecutors, you have law enforcement people that aren't held accountable, and they're able to do these things to people. And Bob had a brand. Bob was able to fight back. I was able to fight back. But you know that a lot of people listening to this program weren't able to fight back, and that now haunts them, or one day it's going to happen to them. 40 feet into my home, I defend my home, and the next thing you know, I'm in a year and a half and dealing with 3 felony charges. And this could happen to anybody.
Well, I know. That's the scary thing about it. That's why we're happy to have you on. Remember, the Virginian Pilot did a big article on your Securities and Exchange situation. And I think it was a 2-piece article, and they did investigative reporting, and they tried to go to Florida, and they made a big deal out of it. What you're saying now is that's like done, right? No, that's been settled. That's behind you as well.
Everything in the SEC case is absolutely settled, John. So it's not an issue there. We're still working through some other regulatory things, but I'm still confident of all of those. But again, it's just one of these things where you see people take an opportunity to pile on, and that's exactly what they've done.
All right, I've got a bunch of texts here coming in from my callers. Sorry, callers, I got about 15. Obviously, you hit a nerve, Daryl. I can't talk to them all, but I'm going to get to the first easy one here. This is from Georgia Newport News. He said, well, I thought Daryl assaulted someone. I get it now. He didn't even assault anybody. Jesus. That's from Georgia. I can't read these all, but I mean, he didn't even assault anybody.
The prosecutor case kept trying to say I stuck a gun in this lady's face. Again, I'm 40 feet in my home. I already had a handgun in my hand because I was coming into my home to put it in the vault because I have 2 young children in the home. 40 feet into my home. The only assault occurred by that intruder on my son, which, by the way, I have pictures of. I gave those pictures to the police department. My son even said on videotape and written statement that he had been assaulted. And to this day, nothing's been done. So for somebody to put their hand, a person who is in the court system, as representing the court, puts their hand on a minor child and is still walking the streets, and then the guy that's 40 feet deep into his home, defending his home, goes on trial, that's the system we're facing.
Unbelievable. All right. I want to thank Daryl Bank for sharing that, Daryl. I know it's tough to go through this over and over, and relive it. I want to thank your wife for being here with us, a good friend of ours and a good friend of the show is Katrina Davis. Josh and Jason, your lawyers, guys, great job. That's all I have to say. And thanks for getting my friend Daryl off and saving his family from this horror. All right, guys, thanks for being with us.